Wonderful. Well, we are so delighted that you've all joined us. Welcome to everyone, wherever you're calling in from. This is so very exciting. Um, I'm just going to cue this up. I'm going to show some slides just to get us sort of in the context of the conversation tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. So this evening's talk is about, call it what it is, what's going on in Palestine. And our guests are Phyllis Bennis and Richard Falk. This is co-sponsored by the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security and the International Peace Bureau. So thank you to them for co-sponsoring this. Our two speakers, I think, are very well known by this audience, probably don't need even an introduction because you know these fine speakers. Phyllis Bennis, co-director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. She helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And her new book is Understanding Palestine and Israel. This is it. And if you're interested, you can go to Interlink Books for that. Nice cover, Phyllis. Professor Richard Falk, who was the former UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories in 2008 to 2014, and Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University. So we are delighted to have both of them. I want to set the context a little bit. So maybe you've seen this map of Gaza and you know that it's been divided into three zones, the red, yellow, and green. So the red zone are where the Palestinians have been pushed into. It's less than, Israel now controls 53% of Gaza. So imagine crushing all of those people into this even tinier space than what they had. The yellow zone is where they cannot cross, and the green zone is under Israel's control, mostly farmland and fertile lands. And as you know, Israel is continuing to demolish the houses and residential blocks, both east of the yellow line. I'm not sure. I think they're still, of course, they're killing people in the red zone, and we'll see that in a minute. So just for you to have that visual. And then I'm sure you all know what's going on in the West Bank. The settlers are just running rampant, burning cars, attacking Palestinian farmers and in their olive fields and so forth. And they have total impunity. So we're going to start by talking about the Trump peace, quote unquote, peace plan and the UNSC resolution, UN Security Council. So as you all know, in October 25th, President Trump created this 20-point peace plan, peace proposal. And it was signed by representatives of Israel and Hamas. And then the US took it to the UN Security Council, who endorsed it in November 2025. The plan was rejected by Hamas. It authorized a, quote, international stabilization force, and we might ask Phyllis and Richard what that means, what they meant by that. It didn't include any Palestinians in helping to craft this plan. It denies Palestine's right of self-determination. And the US was accepted as a legitimate peacemaker by virtue of accepting this plan, and it exonerates the culprits for their past behavior. So that's what we're going to talk about, is Trump's plan and the UN resolution. You all know that since this so-called ceasefire, about 425 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. About 11 to 1,200 have been injured. So it's not a ceasefire because Israel continues to kill Palestinians in Gaza. So I just have two quick quotes from Phyllis and Richard's article. So Phyllis said the resolution is not only a possible violation of UN rules, it also makes the US administration directly responsible for Palestinian oppression. And this is from her article in The Nation. And then Richard has an article in Counterpunch from December. The core feature of the plan was to reward the perpetrators of prolonged genocide, preceded by apartheid, and resulting in making a wasteland of Gaza. So that's the context, and I want to welcome Richard and Phyllis. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, this evening.
Thank you, Abby.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Super. Cole, I'm just trying to, there we go. Okay. So given that context, could you talk to us about Trump's plan and the UN resolution and the consequences of both of those? And either of you want to start?
I always defer to Phyllis
Defer to me.
because she's younger.
Okay, I'll start. As long as we remember that it was something that Mother Jones, the great union organizer, once said, that God made the women, but it took the Rockefeller gang to turn them into ladies. So this is not about deferring to women. First, thanks to MAPA, to the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, to IPB, to all of you for joining us tonight. This is a moment when we have to think of this as a moment of monsters roaming the earth. The global crises, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran, whether it's Greenland, Panama, Nigeria, all the places that have been bombed just this year, Yemen. It's a horrifying reality that we're facing, and trying to keep Gaza at the center of what we're talking about tonight is its own challenge in a certain way. But thanks, Abby, for introducing it in the context of Trump's plan and what the UN has done to collapse its own power and to enable again and again, the UN has enabled US participation, US control of the process underway at the moment in Gaza. This is a plan that was supposed to, it was in two parts, and the first part was supposed to start with a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire in Gaza. We could say that there's maybe a slow fire. We don't see 100, 125, 150 people being killed every day by Israeli bombs, Israeli tanks, Israeli guns, Israeli drones. But we do see 12 or 7 or 15 killed every day. It is still not a ceasefire. Yesterday, 7 people were killed. 2 of them, one was a baby, one was a 4-year-old who died of Israeli-imposed cold. Hypothermia has become an instrument of death for the Israelis. This is still a genocide, and I think that is something we have to constantly remind ourselves of, because we're not seeing it as we were for 2 full years on the front pages of our televisions, of our phones, of our screens, of our computers, daily, 24/7. It's not like that anymore. There's too much competition for death and destruction in the world. So what remains of the so-called ceasefire effort, part 1 of the Trump plan, is that Gaza, as you said, Abby, has been divided. The partition of Gaza, now we used to talk about the partition of Palestine. Then with Oslo, we saw the partition of the West Bank alone. The West Bank and Gaza, of course, make up only 22% of historic Palestine. And yet it was considered a great boon to the Palestinians that they were going to be given maybe 40% of that 22% that was left. Not a surprise that it was not accepted as a great gift, if you will. So what we have right now, the yellow line is the key thing. The yellow line divides the east and the west of Gaza. 53% for the Israelis, 47% for the Palestinians, almost identical to how Palestine was first divided in the Nakba, which was also 53 and 47%, with Israelis on the upper side. Despite the fact that in Gaza, there are no Israelis living at the moment. There are soldiers occupying. There are no settlements in Gaza the way there are in the West Bank. And yet, what we used to talk about as Gaza being one of the most crowded places on earth, this tiny scrap of land, so crowded with over 2 million people living there, all of those people who have survived, sorry, and it's probably somewhere in the area of 1.9 million rather than 2.3 million people, between those who have been killed, those who are missing under the rubble, those smaller numbers who have managed to escape. The Gaza population has gone down. But imagine that somewhere close to 2 million people are now crowded into half of that space. So what the UN resolution did was kind of three things. One, it reversed a process that had been underway for almost 2 years, in which the UN played a central part, that had given hope for the first time in a very long time to Palestinians who continued to struggle for self-determination, for equality, for dignity, as well as for an end to genocide, for clean water, for food, for medicine, for shelter, all the physical things that had been stripped from them. A process was underway at the UN that had started when South Africa brought a case against Israel charging genocide within 6 weeks of the genocide beginning, in the end of November, the end of December in 2023. And within a month, the International Court of Justice had come back with a preliminary ruling that found it likely, it was a plausible case of genocide. And they said because it was plausible, they hadn't finished, it wasn't a final ruling, there were 6 provisional measures imposed on Israel. Of course, all of them were denied by Israel, all of them were ignored, all of them were violated. But it gave people a sense of hope that for the first time, the possibility of accountability existed. And then by the summer of that year, of 2024, you had another resolution. This time it was an advisory opinion of the International Court coming out to tell the world that the earlier effort by the General Assembly asking the court for a ruling on the legality of Israel's occupation overall, not just Gaza, but the whole occupation process, the apartheid that had grown out of that occupation. And the court came back and said, it is completely illegal. The entire occupation that had gone on for more than 60 years was illegal. That had never been determined before. There were individual violations with house demolitions, with violence, all those things. But never until that moment had there been an international court ruling that the occupation itself was illegal. And that was hugely important. 3 weeks later, a month later, the General Assembly met and decided that between those 2 rulings of the General Assembly, of the ICJ, the ruling on the illegality of the occupation as a whole and the preliminary ruling on genocide came together, and the General Assembly passed an incredibly powerful resolution calling for Israel to stop its occupation, to end the genocide. And it laid out a series of things that other countries needed to do. Other countries that were obligated because of the Genocide Convention, because of the Apartheid Convention, were obligated to abide by the ruling of the International Court to impose an arms embargo, to stop trade. All kinds of sanctions were called for. It was an amazing thing. And it went from there to people's movements around the world that had just begun the possibility of pressuring their own governments to do those things, because it means that public opinion, popular movements, social movements, the movement for Palestinian rights all around the world was going to have to be the enforcer of international law, because none of these things were self-enforcing. And finally, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Richard, what ended that hopeful moment of a series of things happening in and around the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, issuing arrest warrants against the Israeli leadership for potential violations of the Genocide Convention. Then we had a reversal. The Security Council did what they have done so often, refusing to take their responsibility seriously. And what made this one worse was that it wasn't just one more resolution that didn't help, that didn't go far enough. Those happen all the time. What this one did was to endorse Trump's proposal, which had no accountability, nowhere, did not end the genocide, did not even talk about the genocide or acknowledge the genocide, did not talk about or end the occupation or the apartheid or settler colonialism. None of those things were even mentioned. Instead, it turned over to the United States to take the place of Israeli soldiers in controlling a stabilization force, some military force. And in doing so, it made the possibility of a UN-driven proposal impossible, because it said that now we're going to give permission to the United States to use whatever force it wants in complete violation of its own charter, because the charter says only under very narrow circumstances can the Security Council approve the use of force. And the US had not brought in any of those forces. So this was a far greater travesty than simply not being enough. This was an affirmative damaging and an affirmative undermining of the Palestinian hopes that something was underway that could lead to accountability. I'm going to stop there, turn it over to Richard, and then we'll come back with other questions as well.
Well, let me continue from where Phyllis left off. She didn't leave me too much to say, and I agree with her pattern of analysis of this lamentable situation that has persisted with much reduced global media and public attention due to this multiple crisis period that we're experiencing. And it can be even thought about that part of this multiplicity of crises is a further exercise of a tactic that Israel has used throughout the whole period since October 7th, which I've called the politics of deflection. You try to make people think about other things than the real issues. They had tried for some years prior to that to rely on the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a tactic to do, rather than dealing with the message, to shift attention to the credibility of the messenger and using defamatory tactics to do that. Let me comment on the UN resolution, because there's one aspect of it that I think is particularly regrettable and indicative of a lack of political will to insist that the UN serve the peoples of the world and the cause of justice and human dignity. And that is the fact that after all the paralysis of the first 2 years of the genocide, the Security Council finally acts and acts unanimously, which I think is a very disturbing subservience to the primacy of geopolitics. Why countries like Algeria and Somalia and several others endorsed this plan that exonerates the perpetrator of genocide and allows the main enabler to not only escape accountability, but to be perversely rewarded for this destructive, unlawful path of behavior. And to have the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, give his approval to this endorsement of the Trump plan accentuates this moment, which I think can only be called one of the shameful assertions of UN authority in the world. And it's a very disturbing impact. At the same time, it's a mistake to discredit as a whole the UN. The political organs are the ones that the public understandably relies upon to make the charter effective and implementable. But in this era of denial of truth and reality that Trumpism epitomizes, we do have to thank the UN for providing a certain reality check by way of the courageous reports of Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur. This has been a notable contribution to the rising public appreciation of the extent to which the behavior of Israel is outside the boundaries of not only law and morality, but any kind of respect for human dignity. And the Human Rights Council, in addition to these reports of the special rapporteur, have also, in a detailed report under the so-called suppressing her name, Navi Pillay, the Pillay Commission of Inquiry issued an 80-page detailed elaboration of the degree to which it is appropriate and indeed necessary to characterize the 2 years since October 7th as 2 years of an undisguised, transparent genocide reported to the world through digital communication and filtered in the West through a corporate biased media, which slowed the process of public defection from the Trump way of portraying what was going on. So this is a turning point of a sort in the perception of Gaza. Phyllis, the other main encouraging part of the UN response is by way of the International Court of Justice, which is an organ. It's really the judicial organ paralleling the political organs of the Security Council and General Assembly, and its two leading decisions, one in the form of an advisory opinion, the other in the form of this interim response to the South African submission dealing with an alleged Israeli violation of the Genocide Convention. In both contexts, a near unanimous court professionally responded, not by way of that representatives in these political organs do, which is to follow the political priorities of their government, but in terms of a professional scrutiny of what international law prescribes as compared to what Israel has been doing. And that's a very important element in the background here, and part of, I think, a more balanced assessment of the UN. And it is one that has the very professionalism of this judicial behavior has so antagonized the liberal democracies, the supposed champions of international law and international cooperation, that it has led the U.S., that is as I've said, the principal enabler, to begin a process of withdrawing from international institutions more generally, and to begin speculations that the U.S. is contemplating a withdrawal or an exit from the UN itself. So we should remember that the League of Nations collapsed partly because it lost the participation of the principal geopolitical actors in the world. And so there's a delicate balance between the implementation of Article 6 of the UN Charter, which calls for the expulsion of members that persistently and significantly violate the Charter, and keeping the universality of participation and membership in the UN. It's a very delicate balance that I'm not sure will be handled in a way that produces what is necessary, and that is a reform of the political organs so that they can act in response to international law rather than be manipulated by the geopolitical discretion given the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which in effect privileged the winners of World War II. The winners of World War II emerged as the most dangerous countries in the world, and it made no sense if war prevention was the cardinal objective of the Charter to give them a free pass, in effect, of being exempt from the implementation of international law and any kind of accountability for their behavior or the behavior of their friends and allies, as this process has disclosed in a very undisguised way. So the failure of international law to be observed was designed to give priority to geopolitics in peace and security contexts. And that priority was also reflected in the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials at the end of World War II, which only looked at the crimes of the losers. And again, set the standards that the winners had no serious challenge from international law or from accountability to the way in which they pursued their strategic interests. So we need, in that sense, and it's long overdue and very difficult to envision how it will happen, we need a reset of the UN, which is certainly overdue after 80 years, that will restore the primacy of the Charter and international law if we want the organization to function as a large part of the publics of the world would like it to function. And so there is a crisis of how the Gaza experience, which is traumatizing for the Gazans and an exposure of the low level of compliance with international law, international morality on the part of the liberal democracies. So there are two challenges. One is the crisis of liberal democracy when it comes to foreign policy and international affairs, and the other, the crisis of internationalism, which has been widely discredited and undermined by the happenings of these last 2+ years. Let me stop there. I know I haven't covered all these issues, but
Let me just add one thing to what Richard just said before we go on. I agree with all of it. This was very important. I would just add that one aspect of the International Court of Justice role in all this with Gaza, the fact that it was South Africa who brought that case, played a very important role in challenging what had been the general understanding of power in and around the United Nations, which, among other things, was that things like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, things like that, sort of belong to the white colonials. They're the ones who get to use those instruments, those tools, right? It's for them. It's not for the whole world. It's for, North America, for the Europeans. Even like Russia and China were not interested in that, in either of those institutions. But the peoples and nations of the global south were pretty much excluded from it. And all of a sudden here, you had an African country, a Black-led rainbow nation, saying, you know what? It's ours too. We get to use it too. And you know what? We get to use it against the real violators of international law. In this case, those who had carried out a genocide, were carrying out a genocide. And so for South Africa to play that role after their own struggle against apartheid had gone on with the UN as a venue and sometimes supporter and sometimes reluctant supporter, but in there, they were the ones best positioned in the world to go in and say, we have a right to this too. This belongs to everybody in the world. And that was a huge breakthrough of what had always been assumed that Africa, South Africa, formerly colonized countries were not what the International Court of Justice was designed for. And suddenly, you know what? It is. And you had people all around the world getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was to watch this rainbow of lawyers, brilliant lawyers, South African, Irish, from everywhere, who were part of the South African team arguing before the ICJ. And so when those lawyers made those almost, the only thing preventing most of the decisions from being completely unanimous was this one judge from Uganda, of all places, who was known to be a very strong supporter of Christian Zionism. Personally, it wasn't her government's position at all. She voted against everything, every single one of them. But everybody else, including the US-based judge, they were convinced by the legal arguments, and they voted that way. And it was an extraordinary thing to see. So that's just one thing that helped to open up this very sclerotic process.
They were not only convinced, but they maintained their professional discipline,
Exactly.
which was, to me, as impressive as being convinced.
It's true. Being convinced and not doing anything with it was not going to help.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. It was truly an awe-inspiring spectacle to watch the South African team at the ICJ. I apologize. Zoom has kicked me out a few times, so I might disappear again. So I'm going to ask two questions just to cue them up. And Julie, can I just get you to be on, ready? If I disappear, then could you take over for the Q&A? But the question I eventually want to ask you is about Iran and the impact of the threats of the US and Israel about attacking Iran. But before that, just in continuation of what you've been talking about, because you were saying, Richard, well, the US might leave the UN or some of the UN agencies. And Phyllis, you were talking about, you had said that the Security Council vote had turned the UN into a direct instrument of the Trump administration. Can you talk about the implications of that for the implementation of the plan in Gaza, and what does that mean going forward?
Well, in one sense, I'm not sure that it means very much. I think that the importance of that resolution is in the domain of symbolic politics, where these countries that opposed what Israel was doing felt the pressure from their assessment of national interests, I suppose, to vote for the Trump plan. But maybe I'm naive, but I don't believe they did that with a good conscience. I think they did it as an opportunistic way of not bringing a backlash. And one of the problems I feel that South Africa has experienced, because it took this historically important initiative, is that it's had a lot of pushback from the US, including this accusation of genocide against the white minority in South Africa itself, and the asylum being given to only to white farmers by the US. That's all part of the reminder. I think the Rubio Trump style of foreign policy is to use a punitive instruments for any behavior by a global South country that is a challenge to the primacy of the kind of winner's world order that was created back in 1945. And in a lower level, we could point to other earlier things, such as the Vietnam War and a whole series of actions in which the UN stayed as a spectator. it can be explained by the Cold War as part of the paralysis, but that paralysis was built into the design of the UN at San Francisco back in 1945. So I think it's important not to exaggerate what can be achieved through these formal institutions. So I would put a lot of stress on what happened in, again, South Africa in the lead up to the release of Mandela and the transformation of the South African elite, that civil society solidarity with the Palestinian struggle is as instrumental in challenging Israel as is the formal institutional behavior that has been admirably exhibited by the ICJ. And just a technical point, that the ICC is not part of the UN and shouldn't be confused with the UN. It's based on the Rome Statute, which is a treaty, and most of the P5 countries have not joined. They're not parties, and therefore they're particularly furious about the arrest warrants because they're not subject. They're not subject in a technical sense to belonging to the ICC in the way they belong to the ICJ. Of course, that didn't bother them when they appealed to the ICC on an urgent basis after Russia's attack on Ukraine. So we see double standards all over the pattern of foreign policy, again by these liberal, so-called liberal democracies.
Unmute, Phyllis.
Sorry. I think that this point about the primacy of civil society and social movements is really crucial. I would point out that in particularly the 1980s, what we saw in the anti-apartheid movement against South African apartheid, where a global movement had erupted with incredible power and moral authority all around the world, much of it strategically, which came from the South Africans themselves, the ANC, what was orchestrating this global thing, but much of it was rooted for its governmental legitimacy in all the different countries in what the UN General Assembly had decided. Because very similar to this situation, you had a scene where countries would bring stuff to the Security Council to say, we should pass a resolution for sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And the US over and over and over would veto it. But then they would take it to the General Assembly. It would be passed with huge majorities. And the US position was, at that point, we don't care because those positions are not considered binding on the international stage. In the international law, Security Council resolutions are binding, General Assembly resolutions are not. But then what happened? It wasn't just, oh, well then what can we do? People's movements took those resolutions calling for sanctions, for banking sanctions, for trade sanctions, for arms embargoes, especially arms embargoes, and went back to their own governments and said, we want to do this. We don't want to be an outlier country. We want to live in a country that abides by international law. So that became the basis for all these countries around the world, one after another, passing their own versions of sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And eventually enough of them did, including US allies, that there was enough pressure on the US that it finally was forced to do the right thing and pass a resolution endorsing sanctions against South Africa that really helped set the stage for what the South Africans were then going to do on their own, which was their own liberation. So it played a huge role. And that same notion of the movement for Palestinian rights being the enforcer of international law in this context becomes really, really important, I think. The only other thing I would say is that the question of fear and economic pressure at the UN is an old and successful story by the United States. If we look back to the first Iraq War in 1991, when the first Bush administration was trying really hard to get the Security Council to pass a resolution to legitimize that war. And they did eventually. It took almost a year of various kinds of pressure. There were threats, there was pressure, there were all kinds of things used. And a number of countries were told that if you don't do this, X, Y, and Z will happen. Other countries were bribed. Ethiopia, Colombia were given new arms packages that the US had refused them before. When only two countries voted against it, one was Cuba that voted against on principle, the other was Yemen, the only Arab country on the council who had just been reunified after decades of being separated, realized it couldn't really support a resolution calling for the invasion of another Arab country. Yemen voted no, and no sooner had the Yemeni ambassador put down his hand, the US ambassador was at his side saying, that will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast. And the remark was picked up on UN mics that they thought were off, the usual thing. But I think that they knew the mic was open because the message was not really about Yemen. They didn't care about Yemen very much. They did care about every other country getting the message. You cross us on something important to us, you will pay a price. And that's where we are right now with South Africa. But it isn't only South Africa. This question of punishments. If we look at the countries that are now on the Security Council, the new 10 elected countries for this year, you have Somalia, which the US bombed. It was the Trump administration's first bombing this year. You have two countries that in the past faced overthrow of their governments by the US. That was Panama and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And you have two countries that are being threatened right now, Colombia and Denmark around Greenland. So 5 of the 10 elected members of the Security Council right now either have faced or are facing US military assault. And yet, you don't have them emerging to say, stand up and say no. So this notion of we can't look to the Security Council to impose international law is being played out once again. But I would just point to one other thing before I go back to, to Abby, and that is that one of the things that the US faces right now, which it never faced before, is public opinion on the side of Palestinians. What the polls are showing us right now is so crucially important. And I'll point to just 3. One is in the New York Times last September, 51% of all voters, and that included 75% of Democrats, 66% of independents, opposed military aid to Israel. That has never happened before. Another one in the Washington Post, 61% of US Jewish voters believe that Israel is committing war crimes. 39% say that Israel is committing genocide. These are Jewish voters, mostly Democrats, but not only. That's never even been imagined before. And the third one, which was from this past March, I guess it was March or April of last year, when the Democrats were freaked out about how they had lost the election and were trying to figure it out. So there was a very important poll that looked at the perspectives of a very specific cohort of voters. These were voters who had voted for Biden in 2020, but did not vote for Kamala Harris in 24. So they might have voted for Trump in 24. They might not have voted at all. They might have only voted for Congress, but didn't cast a vote for president. They might have voted for the Greens. They might have voted for Mickey Mouse. They might have voted, as some of us did, for Gaza in that line. They could have done anything, but they didn't vote for the Democratic position. And these were all, virtually all Democratic voters. And they were given 6 choices. Why didn't you vote for Kamala Harris after voting for Biden? And I thought, well, the first choice is going to be the economy. And then the question will be, what was second and third? That could be interesting. I was wrong. The first was Gaza. 29% of those Biden voters who did not vote for his heir in 2024 refused to vote for her because she refused to break with his position on Gaza. I don't know if the Democratic Party even cares about that poll, if they know about it. They're not paying attention to it in the sense of talking about it. But that's something that everyone in office right now, in federal office, in state office, and even in city offices, has to deal with. That people are in a different place and that politicians are losing votes because they are seen as being too supportive of Israel. That has never happened before. So we are in a whole new world where all these things that potentially could happen at the UN if we supported them at home could happen in a whole different way than we ever imagined.
Yeah, that's great.
Just a footnote to what Phyllis has said. The extraordinary election of Zoran Mamdani in the leading Jewish city of the country is something that would have been, if you had thought about that 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, people would have thought you were, living on another planet. And it has a transformative potential beyond what happens in New York City. And already the Seattle mayor has declared herself a democratic socialist. It becomes a respectable thing, which it wasn't before. I mean, it was a way of discrediting someone by saying they were sympathetic with socialism or had some kind of left orientation. Mamdani has already, it's too early to assess, but he's already created a new political space within the political spectrum that has extremely important potential of being an agent of transformation. And as I've tried to say, without the transformation of the liberal democracies, it will be very difficult to address a transformative agenda for the international institutional framework. They're tied together.
Excellent. Thank you both. So to the audience, we're going to open this up for Q&A. But I do have two more questions if you don't mind. They're rather important. So Iran is still second on my list, but the next question I want to ask before Iran is about the second phase two of the agreement. So what we heard, Axios reported that Trump was going to appoint people to the Board of Peace this week from different countries. And then there's been commentary. I saw something from Mitchell Plitnick, who was formerly from B'Tselem and the International Middle East Foundation for Middle East Peace, that Trump, they have to change their plans because it's not going to work. No country's going to put their forces out to be part of this, quote, stabilization force. So, and that they're going to create a technocratic committee of Palestinians to run Gaza. So can you talk about phase two and those pieces? And is there going to be a stabilization force or a peacekeeping force? But there is no real peace to keep at the moment.
Absolutely. There is, I think, well, let me just speak briefly to Gaza and then turn that over to Richard because he's much more of an expert, of Iran than I am. But I think that the situation in Iran right now is a very dangerous one, facing a very dangerous threat from the United States of direct military assault. Again, we shouldn't forget that the US went to war directly against Iran with Israel back in June of last year, just 6 months ago, after a set of generations of undermining governments and stability in Iran. And I think that the threat of using this very powerful movement that is underway in Iran right now, challenging a very repressive regime, is at great risk of being, quote, helped by the United States. This could lead to a very devastating situation in Iran and globally, because I think what we're seeing here is not just the expansion of US power in the abstract, but it's a very clear thing where Trump has been talking a lot about the Monroe Doctrine and reclaiming the Monroe Doctrine, claiming that it's going to be even stronger. They're calling it the Dunroe Doctrine. And isn't that cute? You know, this language of the reassertion of the explicit 19th century style of imperialism that is not about settler colonialism, but is also not only, quote, about extracting resources. It's also about complete control of territories and peoples around the world. And what is changing most dramatically, I think, right now in Trump's version of the Monroe Doctrine is that that is seen as his starting point. His Monroe Doctrine is global. It's not limited to the Western Hemisphere. So when he's talking about Panama, yes. When he starts talking about Gaza, he's talking about we will rule Gaza. We will use it for creating a Riviera on the Mediterranean. We will use it not for settler colonialism necessarily. That was what the Israelis did. That's not what we're going to do. We are going to just control it. We are going to control Greenland. That's not really part of the Western Hemisphere either. That means going to war against Denmark, and that means breaking NATO. So the dramatic consequences of this expansion of his embrace of imperialism, particularly at moments when he is facing challenges at home, is a very, very dangerous one. And I think Iran is likely to be the next direct target of this kind of imperial adventurism that is going to be very, very dangerous, in probably not too long a period.
Mm-hmm. Richard, in the interest of time, could you speak to phase 2 of the plan for Gaza?
Yes, give me just 2 sentences about Iran, though, because
Of course.
the see, it's the whole context of this recurrent protest activity is very hard to interpret because the West has been imposing sanctions, economic sanctions, on Iran for decades, and the public in Iran has suffered, but it's not necessarily the failing of the regime there that has caused this economic distress. I'm not sure many governments could have survived this long under the kind of pressure, including destabilization, assassination of Iranian leaders, and uh, uh, and who knows what Israel and the U.S. via CIA and other aspects of covert intervention have been doing to stimulate, including these completely unlawful threats to intervene in an internal struggle without any authorization from the UN or on any basis that is legitimate. Just a word or two about the protective force. What you said, Abby, in the introducing this topic is absolutely correct. What government, in its clear, in a sane moment, assuming it has a few, would want to be part of this force that is hostile to the values that are professed, to its perception as an independent political state, subjecting its citizens to danger for without any national interest at stake, no security interest. It's a way, again, of shifting the responsibilities to others while taking the benefits for Israel and the West, particularly the US. I mean, the whole idea of others paying for the reconstruction of Gaza is a moral and legal outrage. To not impose a scintilla of responsibility for the restoration of what has been destroyed through persistent, unlawful behavior declared as such by the ICJ and public opinion. It's the whole context is Orwellian in its distortion of truth and rationality.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could put them in chat. Cole, could you add Julie to the spotlight? And can I add a moment of levity here? It seems like we need it. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second to show you this billboard that showed up in Tehran, which if you look over here behind the taxi, you can see the figures of Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant behind bars. And so that's how they're amusing themselves over there. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a moment of levity for us. Folks, if you could put your questions in, oh, we have to open up chat over there. Hold on 1 second.
It's grotesque levity.
Grotesque levity. Julie, you can't see this, so I'm gonna, because it was sent to me, Julie.
Okay.
So Haynes is asking about uniting, if you could speak about uniting for peace, a way by which, oh, you said this, Phyllis.
No, I
how
didn't Uniting for Peace, but I will say very briefly.
How the GA can circumvent the Security Council.
The Uniting for Peace precedent is a way of the General Assembly being able to take up issues of peace and security that are ordinarily limited to the Security Council. It was, of course, ironically used first by the United States to go to war in Korea, to give a UN imprimatur to that war. The problem is that being passed under Uniting for Peace, which, for example, the resolution that Richard and I both talked about, the resolution of last September, that linked the two decisions of the ICJ and called for enormous levels of sanctions, of pressure on Israel, was passed under Uniting for Peace. Uniting for Peace is constantly being used for Palestine resolutions. The problem is, I think a lot of people have come to see that as somehow inherently enforceable. And they are no more, those resolutions are no more enforceable than any other. The difference is you can take peace and security resolutions under Uniting for Peace to the General Assembly, but to make it enforceable, like any other resolution of the General Assembly, you need either massive social movements around the world engaging with their own governments, pressuring them to do it, or a powerful country, like in the case of Korea, the United States, said, we're going to use this resolution and call for a military force against North Korea and against China and go to war. So it's not any more enforceable. You know, there was this whole campaign a few months ago by a bunch of civil society organizations, which was very well meant, you know, that we should use this tool to bring these issues to the General Assembly. And the problem was they were already in the General Assembly. They had already passed in the General Assembly by enormous majorities. But they're still not enforceable until some powerful country or a collective of not so powerful middle powers or whatever were prepared to implement it. They could do it on their own. Any country in the General Assembly can announce, we are going to start the implementation process. What they did do the second time around was pass a resolution that called for not just the resolution that had already been passed, but a method of keeping track of what countries were prepared to do to implement it. Not very many countries signed on to it, not surprisingly, because most were not prepared to do it. But it gives you an idea of what could be possible. So Uniting for Peace is a great tool at the UN, but it's a very limited tool. All it does is allow the General Assembly to take up issues that ordinarily belong only to the Security Council. Once they're passed by the General Assembly, there's no guarantee that they're going to be implemented any more than any other.
Thank you. Julie, I'll let you choose one.
So, sort of going on what you were just saying, I mean, there was a question about, do you think the UN can be reformed? Or is it so broken that it needs to be abolished and something new take its place?
I'll say two sentences and then give Richard the real answer to it. My two sentences are: one, in 1995, I wrote a book on US domination of the UN, which was in the era of the Clinton administration. Multilateralism was on the rise, everything was great, and it was horrible. The UN was completely captured by the US. And that is all still true. And demolishing the UN and replacing it with something else would be far worse, in my view, because I think it would reflect the current rather than the past World War II era balance of power in the world. And I think things are worse now in many ways. So that's my take on it. I think we still need to fight to reform it rather than destroying it and trying to rebuild something else. Over to you.
Well, I think the issue is one that is extremely difficult to envision a path to meaningful UN reform within the framework of the organization itself, because at every stage, these 5 winners of World War II have the right to block action. No amendment of the Charter can be actualized unless it enjoys the undivided support of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And again, it was a way that these winners designed a system that couldn't threaten their own strategic interests. And that's largely was successfully suppressed in the evaluation. People were so happy that there was a UN created with a very promising preamble that promised to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, but there was no practical implementation of those sentiments in the way the constitutional arrangement of the UN was specified in the UN Charter. And the UN itself has shown immense creativity in trying to be useful despite these constraints. And I referred previously to something like this special rapporteur, Human Rights Council, its commissions of inquiry, and then a really trustworthy judicial arm all of that was really not not envisioned. The authority of the ICJ was compromised in two ways at the very beginning. The so-called advisory opinion was so labeled as to create a kind of ambiguity as to whether it's enforceable law or just an opinion about what is the character of the legal order. And again, the liberal West has shown no serious willingness to conform to the authoritative enunciation of international law in the advisory opinion context. It completely ignored the nuclear weapons advisory opinion of 1996, and the authority of the International Court of Justice was conditioned on voluntary action by states, all states in that context. There was no compulsory jurisdiction, and treaties contain, some treaties, including the Genocide Convention, contain a provision that calls upon disputes under the treaty to be referred to the court for adjudication, but that kind of provision is itself one that requires the consent of states. Whether this new atmosphere creates a political momentum that would favor modifying the Security Council and General Assembly. What needs reforming are the political organs of the UN. Either the restriction of the veto power and even permanent membership. It's outrageous that these 5 countries, three NATO members, are part of the 5, and countries like India and Indonesia and Japan are not members, don't have that status. So it's a completely anti-democratic structure that was imposed and still exists. And you face the dilemma that Phyllis called to our attention. If you push too hard against them, they'll leave, or at least they'll threaten to leave. And particularly the Trump US may leave anyway, because his whole view is leave the world to the geopolitics of the 3 big countries, US, Russia, and China. In my view, he's prepared to make a kind of Faustian bargain with China and Russia and completely ignore any global kind of framework that restrains geopolitical discretion. And so long as that is in place and backed up by hard power, it's very difficult to imagine a plausible path to meaningful reform of the UN.
Particularly because of the finances too. The fact that, this list of 66 organizations that Trump's administration says they're going to pull out of, I think about 50 of them are UN agencies of various sorts. And that means they're going to pull out their money. And that's a huge it means many of them will simply disappear. So it's, part of me thinks, God, if only the US would stay out of all these UN agencies, they could do their work much better. But not if they have no budget. And that's the conundrum that we face.
Julie, there's a question from Mark Ginsberg. Do you see it?
About the
China.
why,
China.
yeah, and you brought that talking about the big three, but could you discuss why China and Russia opted to abstain on the UN Security Council resolution?
That's the kind of question Phyllis answers very,
Oh, thank you very much.
Mm.
very skillfully. So
Very diplomatic on this one. In my view, neither Russia nor China have any interest in supporting Palestinian rights. It's a bother to them. There's no commitment to it. They don't like. They don't have good relations with Israel, obviously, although Russia does in certain ways. But it's not a priority for them, for either one of them, for different reasons. They're not. They don't. Their reasons are not the same. But in both cases, in my view, they don't. It's not a priority for them to challenge the U.S. directly. It has to be worth something. It has to be something important. They try not to antagonize the U.S. except on very specific issues. Russia is willing to antagonize the U.S. on Ukraine. China is willing to antagonize the U.S. on Taiwan. But on trade issues, they want normal relations. They don't want. This is not a priority. This is very similar. I mean, you might ask also, why did Algeria and why did the Arab countries not have a word to say? And the fact is, they have no interest in supporting Palestinian rights. Their interest is in normalizing, we're talking governments. Their interest is in normalizing relations with Israel. They can't do that easily, at least, without either massive repression, because one of the things that unites the Arab world in terms of its people, not its governments, is precisely support for Palestinian rights. And those governments don't care particularly what their people think, but they do care if they could be threatened with being overthrown. And the challenge of the Arab Spring, even though in most cases they went back to the old guard after a certain period, it was not easy in Bahrain, in Egypt, in the other countries where governments were overthrown by massive uprisings. They don't want to see that again, even if it means that 2 years later they'll come back into power. So they have no reason. They're not accountable to the Palestinians. They don't care about the Palestinians. So it's very much the same thing with Russia and China. So,
Thank you.
I would say not that they have no interest, they have no sufficient interest.
okay.
I think they dislike what the interference with a national liberation struggle of the Palestinian sort, and but their basic vision of a desirable world is similar to this tripartite geopolitical arrangement, where there's no kind of accountability law, and it's basically an enlargement of spheres of influence. That China and Russia would be glad to enter into an arrangement where trade and investment are liberalized, and where mutual respect is accorded to greatly expanded spheres of influence within their respective geographic circumstance. Now, Trump, by going after Greenland and interfering in Iran and other, Nigeria has been pointed out, is threatening that the viability of that kind of future for world order, which would marginalize even further the UN. And I think the three of these leading geopolitical actors, none of them want or think the world needs a strong reset UN. So how do you achieve that? What the peoples of the world would definitely support without a huge civil society movement that is directed toward meeting the global challenges, which are completely marginalized, like climate change and the crisis of migration that partly comes from climate change. I see a very paralyzed response to these contradictory pressures that have emerged out of the Gaza genocide. And therefore, I want to avoid wishful thinking. And that means that hope has to be grounded in something that has a political project behind it. It's not enough just to wish for something that is necessary. One has to have also a vision of how to bring it into being that is plausible.
Do we have time for one more question, or are you all wanting to end it here?
There's at least one more. I'm just seeing the question from Deborah Andrew, which I think is an important one because there's a mistake in it that we should clarify something.
Can you read it? Because I can't see it.
Right. She says, your list indicates that Hamas signed the peace plan, then rejected it at the time it was considered and voted on in the Security Council. This seems contradictory. Hamas did not sign on to Trump's peace plan. What Hamas signed on to was phase one, essentially, a ceasefire, return of the hostages and return of the Palestinian hostages being held by Israel, and increased access to humanitarian supplies. That was what they agreed to. They didn't agree to the second part. So that was imposed on them. And it was just called a peace plan, as if both sides had somehow agreed to it when they had. But I would take one more question. Are you fine, Richard, for that? One more real question.
Richard, are you good for one more question?
You mean I should ask a question?
No. Can we ask you one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, Julie, go ahead.
So is there any way to undo or override the Security Council approval of Trump's disastrous plan? Is there any way?
Well, I think that Phyllis gave us an alternate model of a global anti-genocide movement that was rooted in civil society and created a situation where governments really felt the pressure to listen to their own citizens and to their own people. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia summarized it when he was asked why he didn't align Saudi Arabia more with the Palestinian struggle, yet condemned what Israel was doing rhetorically. And he said his embarrassingly forthright response was, I don't care about the Palestinian struggle, but my people do.
Mm-hmm.
So he buys off the population with some rhetoric that is critical of Israel. Israel understands this as a tactical, non-political, non-threatening political move. They'd probably prefer that he didn't make it, but it still, I think, exhibits the fact that most states are governed by elites that think of their national economic and political interests as greatly taking precedence over fidelity to moral values and legal obligations. And that's the world we're living in. And to change that world requires a massive civil society uprising.
Okay, well, we have our marching orders, I think. So, Julie, thank you. But Richard and Phyllis, before you leave, I want people to be able to thank you. So thank you so much for this wonderful webinar and for bringing your wisdom and expertise to answer all of these questions. I want you to see people thanking you. So to the audience, would you please, in whatever way you can come off mute. You can put something in the chat, you can applaud, you can do this with your hands, do whatever you can to thank them, please.
Thank you
Thank you.
for being part of it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, you are so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank
Re-
you.
Thank you both. Thank
you.
all of you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too.
High quality.
Thanks, all.
Lots to think about.
Hey, Phyllis.
And a wonderful
thanks.
large number of people who joined and heard.
We have a lot of work to do.
I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of clarification.
How
Thank
could
you
we
so
send
much.
questions to Phyllis and Richard that there wasn't time to address?
We don't,
Oh, can you answer that, Cole? Oh.
I think it's hard to keep answering a lot of questions from one webinar. I think both of us are doing a webinar a day or more.
I guess if you send questions into MAPPA, we can try to get them
There you
answered.
Send it to Cole. He can answer them too.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the
Apologies if we
audience.
didn't get to your question,
Can you
Richard
share
and
a
others.
recording of this webinar?
You will get it in by
Okay.
email.